Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Oliver Wise, and I am Executive Director of the Bloomberg Center for Government Excellence here at Johns Hopkins University. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. So, our mission at GovX is to help cities around the world use data and AI to transform the lives of their residents. One important way that we do that is through the City Data Alliance program, where we partner with cities around the world to help them apply data and AI to solve real world challenges that are meaningful to their residents. Applications are actually now open for that program. So if you're interested, please be in touch with us. There's the link to the website will be posted in the chat. We find in that program that one of the key sticking points for city data leaders is knowing exactly where and how to apply data to solve real problems. Like that's a real key ingredient. So that's what this webinar is all about. And we're going to address three key questions. First, how do you identify the right opportunities to leverage data and AI? Secondly, how do you get the right people at the table to execute? And finally, how can you execute those projects in ways that are enduring, sustainable, and that build capacity along the way? So we have I'm lucky to be joined here by some of the world's most accomplished public sector data leaders who have really shown the results through their example in cities across the world. And they are now all CDOs and residents here at GovX, and I'm really excited to work with them in this new way. So they are Mike Flowers, who was New York City's first chief analytics officer, and then also on to senior data leadership positions at the state of New Jersey and elsewhere. We have Melissa Breda, who was the chief data officer in Buenos Aires and is now GovX's senior data strategy and implementation advisor. And then least, but certainly not least, we had Joy Bonagiro, who was the first chief data officer for the city and county of San Francisco, and then was later the chief data officer for California. So thank you all very much for being here and for this important conversation. So let's kick it off with a conversation on how do you find the right opportunities within your government to apply data to solve problems. And Mike, let's start that question with you.
Well, thanks, Oliver. Happy to be here, and certainly honored to be on with my co-panelists, given where they've been and what they've done. So thank you for that opportunity. To kind of just cut to the chase, generally I went by the principle of people are looking for painkillers, not vitamins. And by that, I mean, I think sometimes people have a tendency to be prescriptive. They want to go out and show the value and power of data and lead with that and kind of build that as a capacity. And I think that's really important, right? But that's not how you kind of launch into it, or at least that's not how I went about it. It was more people would reach out to us if they had a problem. And so the idea was to focus on that problem first, right? And frankly, usually that problem, at least because I was primarily focused on operations, had to do with backlogs and addressing those backlogs.
Great. Can you give an example of that, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, I think the primary example, the example we worked with was, buildings complaints with the Department of Buildings in New York City. It's interesting because my initial focus, frankly, was mostly on first response agencies, right? Given my own background in law enforcement and national security. So that's where I naturally gravitated. But the first people to come knocking were not them. It was Department of Buildings, and they had this rather enormous backlog that had stemmed from, somewhere in the order of like 25,000 complaints a year with 200 inspectors, and they can't get to them all. And that really was a situation where data really could shine, right? Because then you can just sort of risk rate each of those complaints and attack the backlog logically and where you're going to get the best return on your inspector hour. And that pattern repeated itself during the entirety of my tenure. If we had, another example was clearing catch basins of grease, and there was a significant backlog of getting to which catch basins we need to get to that are having the greatest impact on the flow of water throughout the city. And again, it was really just a matter of focusing on their pain, which was they're getting a lot of heat, both operationally and politically, over getting to these backlogs. And to the extent we could ride in and provide some insight on how best to address those, quickly and impactfully, that was really the way to go. It was really just the most successful tack we took, was addressing their problem head on and then saying, okay, maybe we can help that with data, and then kind of working from there.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Melissa, let's shift over to you. Can you talk a bit about what your approach was in Buenos Aires on problem solving, and especially, using the data angle to bust down silos across city government?
Yes, absolutely. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Much like Mike said, it is a great pleasure for me to share the panel with such illustrious figures. Back in 2020, when I started my work as a representative, as an accountable person for data in the city, I was avidly reading about the initiatives in the city of New York and California to try and bring home some of those ideas. So I want to make a special acknowledgement to the people here today, and especially our Latin American public. So, what worked for us in Buenos Aires was to try and change the perspective, the vision. I think that goes very much in line with what Mike said. You want to think like a resident, like a citizen. It is absolutely true that when I had to develop an approach to use data in the city of Buenos Aires to solve problems, well, I was looking at it through a public officer lens. These are the departments, these are the ministries, this is the umbrella and the flow chart that I have to use in the city of Buenos Aires. So therefore, I need to rely on these databases to solve problems. But to be honest, when a citizen has an issue, they see a pothole or they see a broken trash can or something, they don't think, oh, I need to go to the Ministry of Public Spaces, or oh, this is a safety issue, or this is a public health issue. No. In fact, most citizens are not necessarily aware of the number of ministries, who's in charge of them. Sometimes they don't even know the name of the mayor. And that's all right. That's fine. The point is that we have to think about this problem from a citizen perspective. And that was the real change, to think like a citizen and think, all right, so how does the city work? Well, we have our residents on one side, we have the city, we have public spaces. How do these different components work together? How do they interact? And when we map out those relations, we found spaces where some databases could solve problems. And in fact, you could even develop cross-cutting projects that would address many problems at the same time. I think that's the real value, and where you truly find your bang for your buck, so to speak, and you get your best rate of return. To look at those projects and promote those projects that can have a cross-cutting effect across all departments.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Joy, let's turn that to you. So how do you work with your agencies across city government? How do you find the opportunities? How did you do it?
Yeah, well, I'll start with a little bit of context setting, and also really excited to be here with my fellow panelists and everyone in the audience. But to put a little context around this, I was working in San Francisco, and it was around circa 2016. And this was peak time period. All the news articles were like, Moneyball for government, using data science in government. And we hadn't been doing that work at this point. And one of the peak stories, along with the great work that Mike was doing in New York, was rats in Chicago. Wow, you can use predictive analytics to find, identify rat infestations early. And people kept coming to me as the CDO and they're like, Joy, we want to help San Francisco find rats. And I'm like, I'm not sure rats are a problem. And so I'd go and I'd talk to my departments and I'd be like, hey, there's these other projects going on in other cities. Do you want to do a project like that? And they'd sort of look at me and be like, whatever, Joy, we don't need your help, or rats aren't an issue here, or lead poisoning is not an issue. So I wasn't having a lot of success just sort of cold calling departments to work with them. And then I noticed something, and I sat in the mayor's office in San Francisco, and another group in the mayor's office was our innovation team. And they had a program called Civic Bridge, as well as STIR, Startups and Residents, where they were essentially partnering departments with external, either pro bono help or external startups, which we have a lot of in San Francisco. And what they did was they had an application process, so departments would apply to work with them. And I noticed a couple things about that process. I was like, wow, instead of asking them to work with us, what if we could re-architect the power dynamics where we'd say, here's what a good data science project looks like, using a project topology that we actually leverage the initial framework that Oliver did in New Orleans. So folks who haven't looked into that, happy to share some resources on that. And we said, this is what a good data science project is. And we essentially did a dog and pony show. We had a lot of brown bags. And we said, hey, if you want to work with us, if you want to do something cool, you can come apply. And we're going to sort of select who makes the most sense. And this really played into classic things of scarcity, the notion of being selected and being part of a cohort. And so we were able to essentially, through that application process, one, define what a good project was. Mm-hmm. Two, find projects that they actually cared about, that they wanted to solve versus us pitching projects, which had fallen flat. And third, it committed them to how we wanted to do the engagement. So we said, okay, much like any grant application process, you have to agree to these XYZ things. And so we were able to go from begging for work to, we never said no to anyone or never turned them away. We would divert them into other things, and that's a whole nother talk. But by doing this application process, we were both able to surface the best ideas, committed clients, and architect the engagement. So I strongly recommend an internal application process, even for something like this. You could set up something really quick where people can come and pitch ideas.
And Joy, just following up on that, because I think it's important for this conversation. What were the types of projects? Like, I know I was doing something in New Orleans that was along this ways, but like, how did you adapt that?
Yeah, so what we did was we actually took all the public stories that were out there around data science in the public sector or adjacent sectors. And I have a background in design and design thinking, and we put all the stories into little vignettes, and we had people card sort them and label them into groupings. And so one, Mike, you already mentioned, it was called Prioritize Your Backlog. That was one example of our topology. And we had about 6 or 8, it was around 6 or 7 project topologies that we used to generate, inspired by yours, Oliver, but sort of additional ones and relabeled based on the card sorting and the sort of natural language that people use to describe things versus data science, right? Like, this is a predictive, machine learning, supervised, unsupervised learning. No, we didn't use any of that language with our departments. We used natural business process type of language. Like, what were some of the things? Actually, I can pull up the project topology, but there were about 6 or 8 of them.
Yeah. Finding a needle in the haystack, reprioritizing the backlog, early warning signals.
Yeah, we had flagged stuff early because it could be people or things. A/B test something, optimize your resources, and then we'd give lots of salient and relevant examples. Again, inspired quite a bit by what you did, Oliver. And it worked well combined with the application process.
Great. Okay, so Mike, let's shift back to you. So say you have this opportunity. What do you do next? Like, how do you start the problem-solving process?
I mean, I'm just speaking from my own experience, right? Everybody kind of brings their own idiosyncratic backgrounds to these challenges, right? I mean, the commonalities you want to help, right? So for my part, I started my career as a prosecutor, mostly street crimes, and then moving on to financial. And so my natural default was like, okay, well, let's actually get on the ground with the people who touch the problem and then work from there, right? So my natural process was to not get on the phone, or, well, this is, the phone era. But I might go over to their offices and sit down with the people actually processing the problem. I mean, an example, right, is I mentioned it briefly earlier, is this catch basin problem, people just dumping grease into the streets, right? Now, mostly it's restaurants, but it's, as Melissa touched on, it's sort of a fragged approach, right? Different agencies touch different parts of the problem, right? So you got to go to all of them, right? Because if you just go to the one, they're like, well, there's only so much I can do with this because I got to work with these guys over here and their KPIs are not mine, right? And so, you don't get to the bottom of that unless you actually see it, right? And actually like sit down with the people who are beleaguered and dealing with the problem and work through it with them. And frankly, it just becomes a good investigation exercise, right? Or intellectual curiosity, or whatever way you want to frame it. You talk for my first conversation was with somebody over at the Department of Environmental Protection, whose job it is to make sure the drains are clear. It's like the water department, right? And then, you learn from them like, well, really, we think they're all coming from restaurants, right? And they don't regulate the restaurants. The Department of Health does, right? They go in and do the inspection. So then you go over to the Department of Health, right? And sit down with them. And they're like, well, yeah, we know which restaurants are doing things and which aren't, but really it's happening because of waste disposal. And then you sort of unpack it further and learn that, because of the history of organized crime in New York City, waste disposal for commercial actors is differently handled than it is, that it's not handled by the Department of Sanitation. It's all commercial haulers, right? Which are regulated separately to ensure that they're not in the mob, right? And then you sit down with them and then you actually get a prioritized list. And then you kind of take that all back, right? Or I took it all back to my group, which is just a really small group of analysts that I could afford, and sat down with them and said, okay, well, here's the logistics chain. Let's throw this against what data we have available historically and see if we can use that as a prioritizing metric. And that's basically how it worked, right? It's just you ask questions, sit down, go out in the field. And the field isn't just ride-alongs, although those are fun, right? I enjoy those. But you also want to just sit at the desk because that's where most of the work really happens, right? And just sit down with them and I'm not, Joy, I don't have like a user experience background or anything like that. It was more, maybe I backed into it accidentally, right? Which is like, I want to sit with these people and find out what they're going through. And then I get a lens on how to actually, not just the scope of the problem, but how to solve it.
Yeah, that's a great tip, Mike. And I remember in New Orleans, we were doing a project with our ambulance service to help them optimize the posting locations of ambulances. And we first had some graduate students from LSU work on this project for us to see if they could develop a model. And they didn't do any ride-alongs on the ambulance. They didn't spend any shifts on the 911 center, and gave us a map where the optimal posting location was outside in Algiers, which is on the west bank of New Orleans. There's like one district there. Their recommended posting location happened to be like outside some elderly woman's house in the middle of a neighborhood in Algiers, which made sense mathematically because it was the geospatial centroid of all the likely calls in Algiers. But from a practical standpoint, made absolutely no sense whatsoever. So I remember we really had to start from scratch with that project. And we learned so much by shadowing a 911 operator to really see how that business process works. By doing a night shift with the ambulances to really see what their life looks like on a busy night, and then also hang out with them when they weren't on an active call to really like understand what that slack time looked like. But that was so important to that whole process and to successfully executing that project.
And I mean, you got to admit, that's also a lot of fun, right?
Oh, it was also a lot of fun, and the staff loved it. And it was also totally tickled the 911 operators who never had a data person sit with them. So it was so great for engagement with the rank and file. It just had so many upsides. All right, Joy, I'm going to turn back to you. So can you talk about like getting into the problem solving process, and then especially how you get the right people at the table to ensure successful execution?
Yeah, and would love to also come back to that question of user research as we talked about sustainability
Go for it.
towards
Go
the
for
end.
it.
But I'll answer your question first. So part of our process of evaluating project readiness was having the right team. So before I
Mhm.
even started doing data science, and that really comes at three levels. So before we started doing data science, I actually studied whether or not we should have in-house data scientists versus work with external partners. And to be perfectly honest, we ended up deciding to go with the in-house route, which is again, probably another long conversation. But you really need people who, one, yes, have the data skills, but two, have a client orientation. Because there's, I call it the data science cave, where you get some people who are they love to chew on data, but they disappear into their data science cave and they don't focus on solving the client's real problem. Sometimes they're like, "Oh, I want to try out this new technique." And that's exactly the wrong approach, especially in government where you sometimes have to iterate on the analytical approach to find something that can be implemented, which I think I will talk more about that in sustainability with a specific example. So one thing, having the right mix of expertise with the right orientation. The second sort of level of people at the table is the rest of the project team. And this is really two components are really important, especially as you're working in departments. One, you kind of need that boots on the ground person who can, help you get in with the ride alongs that Oliver was talking about and find the right SMEs in the organization. And those are really the two things, the person who can sort of ensure internal project championing with the department, right? Especially for me, wearing the mayor's hat, having a department liaison who was championing the project was absolutely critical. But then having access to the SMEs to really provide that context. If you're considering a project in your jurisdiction where the department is fighting you and isn't going to get you to access the people doing the work, it's probably not a good choice for it. The third level to think of the right people at the table is what I call the authorizing environment. And this is really two things. I mentioned the SMEs in the departments, and I mentioned the project champion. You need leadership buy-in. If you're doing a stealth project, once in a while I've seen that work, but most of the time, hopefully, your project is going to lead to an organizational change in either behavior, process, resource allocation. And if the leadership team isn't bought in, that's really key. And so what we would do is we'd actually do an executive briefing and they would have to sign a project charter with us that bought into the intents and in metrics in the program. The other part of authorizing environment is political. And we did this in two ways. As part of our selection process, you had to articulate how your project aligned in this case with the mayor's goals. You might have a city manager. I don't know, different people have different alignment, political alignment. Maybe it's your board of supervisors, but you had to align with one of the mayor's goals. And then the second piece was after we had all of our applications and we had selected the project we were proposing, we frankly did like a little side session with the mayor's chief of staff. And in one case, commute shuttles were a huge thing in San Francisco. We had these big buses coming through small streets and everyone was annoyed about it. It was going to be the coolest data science project on the planet. We were so excited. It got vetoed by our chief of staff because it was a political hot potato. And he's like, no, we can't touch that for a year. And so you need to make sure you've kept your political dynamics, people up to speed and are supportive of what you're doing.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Joy. So, Melissa, let's turn to you. How did you develop the right team, and how do you partner effectively to execute the projects you did in Buenos Aires?
Yes. So that is that's a tall order. That's a big question. So I think yes, Joy and Mike touched on some essential processes and points, and it does bring up a lot of memories of my own experience in Buenos Aires. So I remember that when I started thinking, what projects should I promote? There were a couple things that made all the difference for us. On one side, I did a sort of shopping list, of laundry list, so to speak, and I went to visit each of the leaders of the departments to validate some of the hypotheses that we had, for example, on this project of integrating citizen data, right? Is there truly a demand for that? Can I sell this project? Will other departments be interested? So it took me about a month to meet with each of the leaders of the separate departments, making sure that there was a demand and an active interest to do that. Second, and also essential for us, we had to stop being an isolated, insular team that was just relegated to an office corner right beside the staircase. We had to go out and sit down on the planning tables and the monitoring and follow-up tables together with the mayor and with the National Transportation Agency leaders. That allowed us to directly understand the line of thought of the government, and that did a lot to ensure that the investment was correct and that the return on investment was accurate. I mean, the estimations were. Now, there's an important point for me as well. Normally, we want to think that there's this magic formula of how you build a perfect team, right? I suppose if there is such a book, How to Make the Perfect Team, I'm sure we'll all be out buying it right now, or we would all want to read that article, but that's just doesn't exist. There's no silver bullet. Government resources are always limited. The case of Buenos Aires was no different. We started off with a tiny team with some very basic skills and abilities. But the difference for us was understanding our gaps, understanding the projects that we wanted to do, and that was more or less laid out, and what skills gaps we could close in order to make that happen. And when we talk about technical capacity, of course, that's also very important, of course. But as Joy was saying, non-technical skills can be even more determining. The ability to negotiate, the ability to turn insights into action is even more valuable. I remember that my leadership team was measured not just in KPIs or performance indicators. They also had a metric that was how many people did you meet for coffee that month? Because it was during those coffees that they actually managed to negotiate and pull through with the hurdles of the projects. So there's a lot to say for that. When you have to work with areas that are not necessarily familiar to you or in line with you, or even behind your own interests, perhaps even in opposition. I wish we all worked in projects where all areas are on board and they all want to work with us, but sometimes we had to push projects down the line, even against the will of the area, of the different departments. And so we have to go back to this question. What is the true value proposal? I need to promote this project. I need to access to your databases. So what can I do for you? How can I help you as an area so that you can help me and make sure that our projects scale up and progress? If there's no incentive alignment, projects are a no-go.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Melissa. So, we're in this conversation, we're talking about developing and executing data projects, but we want the capacity of the organization to improve, and we want those data projects to really stick and endure. So, Joy, how do you do that?
A few different ways, but I want to pull on something that Melissa just said, which is you can't just do data science projects. You have to have a broader strategy. And you have to make a lot of friends through that broader strategy so that you build trust and relationships. Because I've often said relationships are the currency of government change, right? And but in terms of data science specifically, I'll pull on the thread that Mr. Mike started, which is we had a playbook called User and Context Research Design. So the start of every project started with the research, the ride-alongs you all mentioned. And our particular flavor of this was a good example was we were working with our assessor recorder, which in the US is the county entity that says, oh, if a property sells, how much should we tax it going forward, right? And we had about 42 assessors in the assessor's office. And what we did was our version of ride-alongs was we sat down with them and we picked three different assessors. One who had been working at the city for decades, one who had worked at another county and had recently joined San Francisco, and then someone who's relatively new to the work. And what we discovered was all of their constraints, all the constraints they faced day to day in doing an assessment. Also, we saw how varied their assessment process was, right? And what we did was we packaged all those insights. We would take pictures of their computer setup, and they'd be going through this green screen, old school COBOL based program, and then flipping to Excel and back and forth. And so what we were able to do with that is one, the spark of the relationship. Two, as we presented what we were saying, we had process legitimacy, right? The other assessors who were not used to change, like, oh, you actually talk to our people, right? So you're seeding relationships, you're demonstrating process legitimacy. But then the other thing we did was we learned a lot of things through that process, not just their technical constraints, but we also learned that they had some regulatory constraints. And so what we were able to do, we had in mind this perfect set of specific set of modeling tools, but we learned, and given that they needed to process the output in Excel, we had to change our modeling to essentially downsample into a flexible Excel worksheet. And here's what we did with that Excel worksheet. We user tested it. So we went through multiple iterations and we had user testing different assessors, not just the first ones we had touch points with, but others. And we picked those user testers based on who are the most influential assessors working with our SMEs and our contacts. And what we were able to do is once they tested it and then they saw that, wow, these people from the mayor's office, they're not just testing this. I made a suggestion and they changed it based on my suggestion, and it helps me. They then became the internal champions to carry the work forward. The last piece, so user-centered design, user testing of the model outputs, right? Don't just give a model output and hope for the best. You have to test it. The third thing was documentation and training. And then the last piece of that is we'd revisit the team and the model on a 6-month to 12-month basis.
Great. Thanks, Joy. So, Melissa, what was your strategy for promoting sustainability in Buenos Aires?
Well, I mean, look, and I think much of our audience, many public officers in the audience, understand that the only permanent thing in government is change. And so I think that we have to be very intentional in order to, especially for me, I'm an economist by training, and it is my purview to understand that we're working on a public asset, a public good, that what we're working on has to become a thing of legacy. That is a very important character and of our projects, and I always try to make sure that my team understood that. Much like Joy was saying, I mean, if there was someone in the audience and somebody can say like, okay, sure, that sounds well and good, but I'm very short on time. I have to either do the project or write down documentation. I have a lot to do. Well, documenting is extremely important because whoever follows, absent documentation, they'll find no solid foundation on which to continue their work. But I would say that it is very important to understand what we're doing and to get that information outside of government environments. If it stays only within government, then the impact will be very low, if existent at all. We need to armor to protect and bulletproof this infrastructure by leveraging residents, non-government organizations, socialize the work, and give that public, legitimate, and official character so that there is some follow-up, so that the teams themselves, I mean, the teams within governments, feel the owners of the process when they have to answer questions, and so that the next administration, whoever comes next, can also answer for all of this investment and all of these efforts. We try to be very intentional when we communicate it. And that is maybe something as simple as opening up a blog post in Medium. That's what we did, actually, following the example of some companies that had their blog post. And that's where we would go and see. For example, in Mercado Libre, we opened up our process. And second, we tried to make our data sets public. And whenever we could, we tried to work with an open code so that any other cities that had a similar project, they wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel. They could just look at our data and try to just fine-tune it to their own local reality. Those would be my recommendations to ensure sustainability.
Great. Thanks, Melissa. Mike, how did you think about enduring capacity in New York?
I mean, I think it's important to note up front that every place is different, and then every little patch of every place is different, right? And I guess I say that for a number of reasons. One, I think, there are things you can take from the New York experience or the Buenos Aires experience or San Francisco experience that are broadly applicable. And I think we've touched on most of those, but some of them are really idiosyncratic to the place, right? Like New York basically operates like a state within the state. So it has a huge remit over the city, right? And then you layer into the fact that I worked for a mayor who was very willing to lean in on all that power, right? And lean in on it in a quantitative way, right? So from the get-go, I had a good hand that was dealt to me, right, in order to do the work done by others. I know some that you have, Oliver, working with you at GovX, right? For example, you had a guy like Andrew Nicklin who was running around pioneering open data, et cetera, right? So I got to work with all that. Those were part of the hands that I was dealt. But what I guess I'm really getting at is I think culture trumps. And so for me, culture, given my own background, was I need to make and to be clear, I wasn't operating off a plan. I kind of made everything up as I went along, right? Which, to Melissa's point, you'd want to document. I just didn't really think had anything worth documenting until after it started working, right? But really, to cut to the chase, it was, okay, well, all the work gets done at the civil service layer down, at the individual agencies. So you have to start and end there, right? And if you want it to stick, because, we've had, 2 mayoral changes since I left, right? Then you're going to have to, bake it with them because you don't know what you're going to get politically, right? Whoever gets. We don't vote for people based on managerial competence, right? Which is, I guess, sort of a controversial thing to say, but, everybody has their own style of running things. But, so my relentless focus, frankly, was on those subject matter experts, those technocrats who had to deal with this on the day, every day, right? And what would be a persisting capacity that would speak to what they would want to do to better serve the citizenry, to better do their jobs, right? Because I think, honestly, I think you have to constantly be mindful of both the big P and the small p political, right? And that's everything from labor relations to, okay, well, that's a hot button topic. We really don't want to go there, right? But the reality is the work is going to remain the work. The trash gets picked up, the fires get put out, right? Kids get taught, potholes get filled, et cetera, et cetera. And so if you bake what you're doing into those processes, however they're surfaced in your individual city, you got a far likelier chance of it persisting. However, I don't want to dismiss the value of socializing this stuff, right? I really am I'm not really much of a PR person or a public speaker. I just sort of preferred to operate under the radar, right? In part mindful of what Joy was talking about, because I was directly connected to the mayor's office, and that'll get you so far, right? But it'll also not get you very far if you go in and you try and Bigfoot everybody all the time, right? So I just tried to kind of be, I guess, a New York version of humble, right? and then, but there were a lot of people that picked up on what we were doing and then just kind of blasted it, right? And that really helped from a political sustainability standpoint, because there was this constituency, in my view, rightly expecting their governments to be more competent about how they went about doing what they're doing, right? So you had, that work that's been going on up at Harvard for a while, your shop, a number of other articles, et cetera, people at Code for America who were writing those pieces, et cetera. That stuff just, that helped, right? Because when they try, and trust me, there are people that don't want transparency, right? They're perfectly happy with the way things are. And so you have to embrace that and meet them head on. And I think one way to do that is to build a counter constituency who will try to stop, eradicating what you're doing. And that's, sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. I got lucky in New York, right? Because there's a robust civic technology community and a community that works around the data that we release, right? But some places it's just not as developed, right? So it's a variety of things, but I think it really comes down at the end of the day that the culture is the most important thing. And if you operate within that culture that you find, which is, there's all these little microcultures around that larger meta culture, right? And you operate within that, then you're going to have a lot of luck in terms of people keeping what you stood up going after you go, if that makes any sense.
Totally. Thanks, Mike. All right. We have time for just one audience question and 30 to 45-second answers from our CDOs and residents here. So our friend Brendan Babb, Chief Innovation Officer in Anchorage, asked a question about data quality. And, in cities, you're going to run into messy data all the time. There's an impetus to get value from it, especially to apply AI on top of it. How do you balance messy data and trying to get value? Let's do Joy, Melissa, Mike.
Yeah, I will actually argue that I've seen data quality issues overstated. Here's the thing. This is going to be a slightly wonky answer and then a less wonky answer.
Great. In 30 seconds.
Data quality issues, if they are normally distributed, learn where and why they came up by doing a great exploratory analysis phase with your department. Oh, we changed systems then. Okay, we won't include those years, right? And so you have to do a robust exploratory analysis phase to study the errors, and you can often address a lot more of them than what people think. I think I think it's overstated most of the time.
All right. Melissa, what do you think?
That was the main issue that we had in the city of Buenos Aires. And I confess that it was probably the part that was the least sexy part of this. Because when you tell everyone, hey, it's time to clear the data, it's time to do quality, everybody's going to hate you for it. But it is absolutely indispensable, especially in the age of AI. We cannot afford to not have a data quality process. And we just need to keep in mind and remember that that is one of the main responsibilities of the chief data officer, of the data leader, right? AI makes us question ourselves and understand, so what's my job? What should I do? Should I apply AI everywhere? Do I have to know about the last thing in the last development of Gen AI and what have you? Well, look, it's an investment that always pays itself, pays for the effort. The challenge, I think, is that like any government team, the data needs to show value. And sometimes that work is very hard to convey. That value is very hard to convey and explain. You have to be very strategic, very intentional. And you have to be able to show what happens when you don't ensure data quality versus what happens when you do have data quality. We institutionalize or take that conversation to the highest level, to the meetings with the mayor, showing how some numbers that were taken as gospel, for example, the number of businesses in the city, Once we cross-referenced all databases and we cleaned the data, the number was very different. And that absolutely changed economic development policies in the city of Buenos Aires. So I don't think there's a simple answer, but you have to keep it in mind.
Great. Well, I think we've come to the end of our time. I want to thank Mike, Melissa, and Joyce so much for your insights. This has been a great conversation. It's always great talking to you. And I hope the audience enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Just a couple closing thoughts. We will be hosting another webinar on Wednesday, April 8th at noon Eastern Time called What to Expect from the City Data Alliance. There's a registration link in the chat, or soon will be, and representatives from some of the current cities that we're working with in that program will be there to talk about how that program works in practice and what to expect through the application process. And relatedly, on that same note, applications for the program are now open, and please go to the link in the chat for more information and to request an application. So thanks again to our panelists, and thank you very much to our audience for attending. Bye now.